All right. Hi, Ben.
Hello.
You've told me that Professor Galambos intended to publish his Theory of Volitional Science, and then he had sold pre-published copies for $500. But as far as you're aware, he never began that work?
Actually, he did. In setting up the trust account, he set up a special trust account where the monies that he got in for his book were not commingled with his own personal assets. And he did that I'm not sure when the trust started, probably in the mid to late 60s. Because by that point, he had moved from the concept of what was then understood as laissez-faire economics, and he was developing a concept of freedom. And out of that, along with all of his physics, emerged, and I've talked about this before, an entire theory based on a postulatory structure. When that finally emerged and he began to work on it and develop it into great depth, he then realized that this was of Newtonian stature. And he knew that it had to get into the preeminent form, and that is in a printed book form. And so by the mid to late 60s, he realized he needed to do this. And he had an audience, and he pre-sold the book, and he put the money into a trust fund for that purpose. So yes, he was looking very hard at that very early on.
Okay. And you mentioned to me one other time that he'd raised actually a lot of money for that.
Somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million.
And something happened to that
yes.
fund?
The man who had taken control of it, he took that money. His job was to invest it, but it was supposed to be on a prudent basis, put it in stocks and bonds and that sort of thing. But in fact, he was the one that I listened to the lectures to. He was the one that had the office in the 32nd story of that building. And he was involved intimately with the goings-on of San Diego. And he knew that there was a section of San Diego, downtown San Diego, where the new, it's not so new now, but the Padre baseball stadium was going to be placed. And they were also going to build that was on the drawing boards, a beautiful convention center. And he knew about this ahead of time. So what he did is that he took, without asking Professor Galambos, he went and bought a good chunk of these two, what they were row houses at the time. They were run down buildings, and he bought them on the foreknowledge of what was going to happen. But he didn't bother to go and talk to Professor Galambos. And I think if he had been honest with Professor Galambos, he wouldn't have allowed the book money, obviously, to be used for it. But he would have probably gotten other money to it, because Professor Galambos' father was an architect. And his father had, in the past, when he moved to New York City from Hungary, bought buildings in New York City, improved them, and then sold them. And so if Professor knew about it and they had arranged it up front, those buildings had a tenfold increase in value. But unfortunately, it came out that he misappropriated the funds, and they ended up, and the man ended up going to jail for this. And all of the money was basically lost. They sold the buildings at a loss, and it was a disaster. But sure enough, 10 years later, or 8 years later, they built a beautiful premier convention center. And then some years after that, they built 2 blocks over a baseball stadium, and now one of the premier visiting spots near San Diego Bay, where all the restaurants are, was these 2 buildings. And they would have been gone from $1.5 million to $20 or $30 million.
If only.
If only. But Professor watched $2 million in the late 70s just, or no, actually this was in the 80s, just evaporate into nothing. And so he had a promise to produce these books, and nothing happened. And that's one of many things that happened that discouraged him from actually producing the book himself.
Okay, so as he's getting closer to seeing that this may not happen in his lifetime, did he make any provisions for the publication of the work in his will?
Yes, he did. In fact, and I don't know if I had mentioned in the earlier videos about what he died from. Did I, by chance?
I think you did, but go ahead. And
all right. The dark ironies of the universe, or dark jokes, is that here is this man of stellar intellectual capacity, and he dies of all things from Alzheimer's. And Alzheimer's just eats your intellect from the inside out. And it was just absolutely horrendous. In the last couple of years, he was almost basically gone. But one of the last things, cogent, intelligent, far-sighted things that he did was he forced into his trust, and into his will and trust, that Bill Martin be made a literary executor. In fact, he basically created the term. And so later on, when his will was executed, there were some issues because this was not a common term in the legal vernacular, but it was resolved. And so Bill Martin was made the literary executor with the intention of being the one that oversaw the publication of his work. So
quite a job.
Yes.
And why did he choose Bill?
As I mentioned before, by the mid 80s, Bill Martin and Professor Galambos had gotten to be close. And Professor Galambos recognized Bill's stellar talents. He was a literary. As I mentioned before, he had read all the classics, from the Russians to the Greeks to he read all of Shakespeare from cover to cover, including all of his sonnets and poems and all the rest of it. He was vast in his culture and learning. And Professor knew this. And Professor also knew, when it came to his own work, Professor's work, that Bill would do everything as Professor wanted it. And he was absolutely dead on about that. So towards the end, of all the people that were in his life at the end, I would say that Bill was premier in Professor Galambos' life. And so when he saw what was devolving around him, he said, I have to make sure that this comes to Bill. Because a lot of people in the Institute did not like Bill. Or didn't, I guess, maybe not dislike him, but Bill would tend to rub them the wrong way. And so, and that included probably Mrs. Galambos and the two people who became trustees, or the one that was becoming the trustee. And then later, Mrs. Galambos tried to add another one on after Professor had basically slipped out of the world. He wasn't dead yet, but he was not here, as it were. So the last thing that Professor Galambos did was to say, I need an literary executor to oversee, and he spelled out what it was supposed to be for the book, in the book, and Bill Martin will be my literary executor. And that was probably the last great decision that Professor Galambos made.
Okay, and so there was no trust issues. I understand that he sometimes had trust issues with people, and as far as his work was involved, so yes. He trusted Bill.
Yes, he trusted Bill.
Okay.
Bill never did anything the professor considered a betrayal with regards to his knowledge and the leap forward. And Bill really, truly did understand.
And he took it seriously.
And he took it seriously. And that Professor had gone light years ahead of where people say the libertarians and the free enterprise economist and all the rest of this. I mean, this is like primordial thinking. But it grew, Professor's achievement grew out of this. But through the Newtonian revolution and bringing it to the human endeavor, it exploded vastly beyond what most people are aware of. But he grew out of that, and so most of his community was still embedded in laissez-faire economics and all the rest of this, and didn't grasp at its fundaments what had happened here. Bill, on the other hand, completely and thoroughly understood. And because he not only had he studied, Bill Martin had studied huge amounts of his literature, he had also read enormous amounts of history. And so the two together gave him the perspective to say, this is something fundamentally different than anything and everything else. And by the way, Professor Galambos invited von Mises to give a lecture at his institute. And von Mises received the single largest check for a lecture given to an audience in a single lecture from Professor Galambos.
So he actually came and
he gave
in Los Angeles
and he gave von Mises came and gave a lecture in Los Angeles, and Professor Galambos brought in well over 600 people to hear von Mises. Completely packed the place.
Wow.
And then cut him a check and gave him the lion's share of the profits to this man.
Wow.
So he knew von Mises and awarded and rewarded von Mises, which was the preeminent laissez-faire economist of the time.
Yes.
But Professor said, that's the beginning. If that's where you're at, it's not going anywhere. Or we're going to face hydrogen bombs dropping on our cities. It has to go way beyond that. And that is what Bill recognized. Bill knew it. And Bill also had read all the economics and von Mises and all the rest. So that's the reason Professor recognized in Bill Martin that Bill Martin knew what the real achievement was, where the urgency was, and what needed to be done. And he knew that if it came to Bill, he would get it done.
Okay. And so 1997, Professor Galambos passes away.
Yes.
And work begins soon after?
That is correct.
And Bill chooses a couple of young men to help him with this task?
Yes. There was my... by that time, because of the syringe deal, and as I mentioned, I had a falling out with Matt Mazer. But by that point, Bill had come in and he was working regularly with Matt Mazer and raising funding for U.S. Medical. And I was working with Bill to do this. So on a day in and day out basis, my relationship with Bill had changed. It had gone from a mentor-student type of arrangement to more of associates, contractual associates he was raising money for an enterprise that I had hoped, or was hoping at that point, that would bring in the money to finance the resources. Then I also recognized, as Bill got involved, that he was getting a large percentage of, he was getting a good percentage of U.S. medical stock, plus a lot of money for finder's fee. So he had a position in U.S. Medical. So if U.S. Medical went, between myself, my parents, and Bill Martin, we could have a serious chunk of change. Mm-hmm. Any one of us would have the resources to then trigger V201 in a serious, very, very serious way. So we'd become allies in working towards that.
Did that become Bill's goal too?
Bill had always wanted. In fact, I had spoken with him years and years before in the 1960s. He tried to create some mechanisms to do V201 and V50, but he didn't take off. And I think, well, I won't go into it at this point. At some later video we can talk about that. But so this was another opportunity that both of us could see could take us to the next level. So then my relationship with Matt deteriorated because of my concern about the automation machine. But Bill and I continued to work on a very close basis to bring in people.
Okay. So he brought in you?
Oh, that is correct. So I came in and Bill said, all right, Professor is now gone. Professor had given Bill a copy of his trust. Mm-hmm. And so he knew he was an executor, a literary executor. And he began to push the trustee. And the trustee pushed back. But finally, Bill went in and got, I think he got a court ruling or something on this.
Oh, okay.
I forget. I don't remember the full details, but he pushed and said, this needs to be done. Because what had happened was two individuals had tried before Bill. The first was Mrs. Galambos. And she attempted to produce the magnum opus. But she started with making one little book it's a nice little book on the history of Professor Galambos, and I have it somewhere, but it was a small little sliver of a book. And so she produced that as kind of like a primer to figure out how to make the book.
Okay. Is that the one, Thrust for Freedom or something?
No, that was Professor's work long before that. But this was in the mid-1990s before she passed away. And she was hoping that would, she could get some traction there. And that was what I was understanding what her plan was. And then finally tackling the beast. Mm-hmm. It truly is a beast. Then she fell ill and died. She died before Professor Galambos. And there was another fellow, I can't remember his name. And he tried. And he didn't have the requisite capacities. Mm-hmm. There was at that time only one person on the planet that could tackle this. And that was Bill Martin. So when Professor died, before Professor died, the trust and the will didn't kick in. So they had given the people that were overseeing the trust, who then became the trustees upon Professor's death, had assigned it, because the trust hadn't kicked in yet, to this young man because they could control him. Oh. Okay. He was 20 years there younger.
Couldn't control Bill Martin.
What?
Couldn't control Bill Martin?
No. For better or for worse, and mostly for the better, when Bill set his mind, he was a very powerful individual. He had his views and he knew how it was going, and they, for the most part, aligned with what I saw. And I'll say more about that in a little bit. So between Mrs. Galambos' death and Professor's death, the executor that was soon become the overseer had this young man, and they tried and for a year, 9 months, or I forget how much time, probably about a year, they just played with this, and he tried and he tried and he tried and tried and tried and tried, and then Professor died. And then we cleaned up his apartments and his houses, and then Bill stepped in and said, I know it now has to be done. And there was some pushback, but he got it.
Okay, so it's you and Bill and
there was another young man who'd been around for a while, was wanting to learn how to make movies and that sort of thing. He was going to San Diego State to study movie making and all that. We were friends, and I helped him build a rolling stand for one of his movies for San Diego State. That was entertaining. And he was a bright young man, probably another 10 years younger than myself at this point. And so Bill Martin got myself and this young man and said, we're going to produce Professor's magnum opus. And so that was our team.
I don't know, did you mention his name?
Eric Falvey.
Okay. Was Eric part of the V50 group at
Oh,
Bill's?
yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
so.
he had V50, had 201, and was taking other courses by that point.
All right, so I need to go back just a little bit.
Okay.
And I think you told me at about 1970, Professor Galambos had chosen his best V50
Yes.
and his best V201 course, and then had them transcribed for the eventual task of publication.
Correct.
So these had just been sitting and waiting for this time.
That is correct.
So now you three gentlemen take these transcripts and your work begins.
Yes. Let me let me talk about those transcripts really quickly.
Sure.
The reason that Professor never went back to his transcripts, he could have gotten someone to do it, could have probably even contracted with Bill to do it. But in Professor Galambos' mind, and he spoke about this. If you go back, he has thousands of hours of videos, and I've heard, we've all, and if those who are from that age and back then and have heard this, you may have heard him, Professor Galambos, speak of this, that the theory came out of laissez-faire economics, and that was V50. But as he got further and further along, in the late 60s, early 70s, and he started to see the power of volitional science and where it was going, he realized he got it backwards. He wanted to start with the theory of primary property. He wanted to redo it. And starting from the postulatory structure, essentially the first three sessions of V50, and then launch directly into V201 from first principles and build the whole damn thing out the same way that Newton built out his Principia. That was his goal. Mm-hmm. And then what happened was then he started getting, and he got enough money and he was getting financing, and then his literary estate went kaplunk. Mm-hmm. Lost the money. Second, he was starting to show signs of Alzheimer, early signs of lacking the ability to focus. The young Professor Galambos, the young man of, if he had gotten it when he was in his 20s and early 30s and into his 40s, that young Professor Galambos, if he had the postulatory structure in hand and knew what he was going to have, he would have produced the book. But it was a cascade of things. But he knew it had to get published, and he knew he had a reasonable facsimile of what it needs to be. Mm-hmm. And that's when he sat down and he gave his best rendition in 1968 of V201. And once he had that, he said, as far as I can, in lectures, that's my best example. And he found someone and paid them to transcribe his best V50 and his best V201 in type form, single, typed on one side, double spaced, the whole bloody thing. No paragraphs, maybe a period here, periods where the sentences ended. 5,000 page, one long paragraph. Okay? No headers, no titles and subtitles and chapters and all the rest of it. Just one vast long paragraph.
I don't know. Maybe she was not a professional transcriptionist.
Well, but you don't... She might have put paragraphs in. I may, but it was, she's sitting there typing and listening, and, every so often she probably did hit the return key, but you're typing, listening to this man, and you're getting it. So, and I do remember, I think there were some paragraphs and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So we had this big box that came from the 1970s. So when Bell pushed the issue and said, this is going to happen, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it the way Professor told us in all of his lectures, because the executor had also listened to V50, V201 on all the other courses. He knew what Professor wanted. Mm-hmm. He was an attorney, but he had
the executor of the trust?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So finally, they delivered these boxes. These legal-sized boxes. Where
yeah.
I forget how many we had, 5 or 10 of these boxes.
Wow.
Of all of these, and then I can't remember if they were in envelopes and just one after the other. I think they were broken up in lectures. So there was lecture 1, lecture 2, lecture 3 of V50, and then there was here all the lectures for V201.
Okay. Wow.
There we sat.
And so what was your first task?
All right.
To go through it all and figure out what was what? Or?
Oh, okay. So the first thing is how in God's green earth do you get from these boxes typed into the computer? So Bill turned to me, knew my experience with computers, and said, we need this in the computers, and we need it in yesterday. So, and I realized this is 1997, mid-1997, 1997, and so I knew I had worked on Microsoft systems. Linux was coming out, and I was working experience with Linux, and that was about the time, on a personal basis, I walked away from Microsoft and never used it again on my personal computers. I went Linux early. But I knew the entire publishing industry used Macs. So called up, and I got 2 of their high-end computer systems with the max memory, which is nothing by today's standards, but we maxed them out. I got the networking set up, and I got them all communicated. Then I got a big, huge industrial copier, Xerox, a copier, with the ability to scan, but not print, but to change and send into the computers.
Oh, wow.
So we just took these stacks, and we just started feeding it in.
Was it auto feed?
Auto feed.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, we were. But it was older paper, and it was a little brittle. So you had to be careful, and every so often it would jam.
30 years old. That would have been almost 30 years old if you did that in the 1970 or thereabout.
1990s, yeah, 97, and it was printed in 70.
Yeah, in 70, right. So it's almost 30 years old. That's old.
25 years old. So here is this paper.
Yeah.
It was good paper. Professor made sure it was on good paper, so it wasn't like,
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, he got cloth. It was part cloth, and that sort of thing. So we fed this through, making sure we had to stand there. 5,000 pages. Mm-hmm. So we finally got them all printed in files, and we got the data structures and everything. We got it. But now it's just 5,000 pictures.
Oh.
So I go out and I look for the best optical character recognition program.
And that puts it into manipulatable.
Yeah, manipulatable
Text
form.
files.
Text files,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Just text files. And so it would read, and so we just sat there for hours and hours taking each one of these files and converting it to text. But it's like 98, 99% accurate.
Uh-huh.
With 5,000 pages.
No.
You know, let's say it's 98, so 10% is 500 pages. So 250 pages, or 150 pages of this text scattered through it is completely wrong.
Scattered through it randomly.
Yeah. So what then we did was then we applied word scanning, word spelling. So we'd have to go through and find the mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And we would then go back to the tape and listen and figure out where it was and change it. We would guess. Then once we had that done, we did our first printout. Just the raw text.
Uh-huh.
And then we each took a turn. Each of us got a recorder, and we sat and listened to the original tape and read the document. All 5,000 pages. Make sure that it was correct. 3 of us. So, well, it's 5,000 divided by 3 is 1,500.
So close.
1,500 pages of listening and reading and listening. And we went through.
Mm-hmm.
That took another month of getting it all clean. Then we started. Well, then we had to. It had to be sans serif. You know what sans serif is?
It's got the little...
Serif is
Yeah.
a serif is with the little cups and on
Yeah,
the
yeah.
characters. Sans
eyes.
serif
Oh.
is the clean.
Oh, without it. Okay.
Sans means
Oh, right.
I think it's French, not serifs.
Right.
So we had to find a beautiful sans serif. So we spent another days and days. And we would go to these different places that were selling the fonts because this had to, this had to be done on a proprietary basis. We had to have, legitimate fonts to do this. So now we had to do the fonts. So we spent and went through font after font after font. And as you know, my artistic ability is not the best. Bill's much better, very much better. So I would say, how about this one? And he goes, no. And I'd find another one. No, oh, that's getting closer. But this is not right and this is not right. And at that time, I didn't have an adjustment programs that I even have now that I could have adjusted the fonts. But I didn't want to play with them. So we spent hours and hours to find just the right font.
Do you remember the name and what we decided on?
Oh, heavens, no. Oh, heavens. There are so many thousands of different fonts.
Oh, really?
Oh, fonts. It's an art form in and of itself in the printing industry. Yeah. So we finally find it. And then we had to, because there was the header and the titles, and so we had to adjust it and make sure that the small caps and the large caps and the punctuation was all correct, as well as all the symbols. And then we had to figure out the layouts. That was another thing. But then, the real fun thing was, Professor had hundreds and hundreds of slides. The slides had to be in the book.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
So now we have boxes and boxes of slides.
You don't know exactly where they go?
Oh, we know where they go.
Oh, okay.
How do you get them into the computer? Put them on the page, and then eventually you're going to put them in PDF, send them to a printer that's going to print them on the four color offset printing plus black, and then you have to match and blend it, and so you would have four plates in the four plates.
I think it's 3 in the black, isn't it?
Yeah, 3 in the black.
Yeah, 4 altogether.
But the black in the color slides, they also use black to make up the color. So you would use 3 colors in black so you get a sharp black. So now you've got a little slide projecting on the screen, which is what Professor wanted. And he had people, but he made a lot of those slides himself.
Wow.
And he had done the colors, and he had chosen the colors, and you wanted to stay true to those colors. So now you have to scan them in, color balance it there, then put it into the printer, onto the page on your typesetting program. Make sure the color holds there, then transfer it to PDF, and then transfer it to the PDF and the coloring to the shop that would separate it. And so you had to do color balancing through this whole damn process.
Oh my gosh.
That was another
I never envisioned it in anything but black and white. So you've got all these color things going on too.
Yeah.
And where was the financing? This was coming from the trust?
At this point, it was coming from the trust. Mm-hmm. Week after week. To do this right. Mm-hmm. This is a noble work.
Yeah.
We were burning, it was taking serious money to do this. And we hadn't even started on the first book yet.
Oh.
And then finally we figured out that fell onto my shoulders. Eric Falvey wasn't in a position to do it. He was a move. He did help on the color. Mm-hmm. That I do remember. He did help on the color because he was in movies, and so we worked together to do color balancing. Because what happens is that the scanner, the whole color range, what can be and what cannot be received through the different process, and you have to compensate. So you have compensation processes, and we finally worked it all the way back, and we finally got a printer, a color laser printer that matched what the offset printer would be. So we would print these things out through the whole process.
That must have been an expensive printer.
Back in 97? Yeah. It was about a $2,000 or $3,000 printer.
Yeah, wow.
And so maybe more than that.
Probably more.
And maybe it was a laser printer, scanner, color. I think it was all-in-one machine. No, I think it was closer to $8,000 or $10,000 dollar machine.
Sounds better for you.
And so we finally got the whole thing. We got our fonts. Then we worked on the typesetting. What would be the pages? And then we had to choose the programming. And it was an Adobe, a little off the corner, not what most people use. I think it was, I can't remember the name of it, but it was dedicated specifically to make serious books, major multi-volume books to handle the indexing.
Oh, wow.
So we had to get the software up and operational and get the license taken care of, and then we had to link to the data, and we had 2 stations and all of this just before Bill, I could print out the first copy of the first chapter to give to Bill to start his red marking.
Oh, wow. So that's how you did it? You'd print it out, you'd get it to a point where he could actually start editing?
Yes.
Then he would edit by hand and give it back to you guys, or
right.
you, or...
Yeah, and okay. So what happened is that, and we printed it out, and the books themselves, as everybody knows, it's an 8.5 by 11 book because it's out there right now. We'll talk about that in a little while. But what happened was that when I printed it out, we were using high quality paper too, so that our versions of the book and the evolution of the book would stand at least some of the test of time. Mm-hmm. We were using quality paper. I would print it out, and it looked the way it eventually would look in the book itself. So Bill could always comment and say, well, we need to, adjust the paragraphs and the look. And so it had to match what the end product was. Mm-hmm. So Bill would get that, chapter 1, and he would then take a red pen and then notes, and there would be notes going down the side, and do this, and erase this, and the rule was, we never added a word.
That answers my next question.
Never added a word. We could delete,
Uh-huh.
but you couldn't delete in such a way as to change the meaning of what the man was saying.
Right. So you had to leave his content untouched, but you were just formatting it for a visual
And there would be
appearance and
sometimes
grammatical.
right, and sometimes he would say something and then say it again.
Oh, okay.
You know how we go, well, if you do it this way, or wait, if we do it this way,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
you would have multiple iterations, and it doesn't read well.
Right.
So you would cut those out, and you would take it, and you would figure out if he had said it. The rule is that if he had said it flawlessly through the entire thing, you could hear Professor saying those words, and it really did. It really came to that. If you had listened to hours and hours of Professor, and you then started reading this book,
Mm-hmm.
when it got done, it was like your mind added Professor's voice to it. It was magical. And so you could open up anywhere, and within a half a paragraph, you were hearing his voice again. But it was the flawless message,
Uh-huh.
not the message that, we all are human and we can't do it perfectly. We're not machines.
Right.
And Bill took that task. And the art of punctuation, putting a semicolon, a comma, 3 dots, and then the thing, and arranging and the sculpting with punctuation is a pure art. I sat and watched Bill perform. And so what happened was, once we started, Bill would start the editing. He did all the editing. Words go in, what words come out, what punctuation. We would always ask and say, hey, should a comma be here instead of over here? Should we put a semicolon? We go back to him and go, okay, that might work. No. And he had the final say. He was, as my dad said when he was running the 6M partnership, at the end, he said, I'm the benign dictator. Bill was the benign dictator because he was the master at it.
Uh-huh.
You could ask, question, his word was final. And when I watched evolve out of that, I was completely and totally happy. It was like magic falling into the word on the words in the page. And then he would get it done, page after page. He would give it to me, and I sat there. And I entered the changes in. What Eric started was he was kind of like Bill, mercurial and that sort of thing. Bill gave him the task to start indexing. And the index for this 5,000-page book, when it finally got done and when I printed it out, was 600 pages long.
Oh my gosh.
An index that is 600 pages, not the books.
Was that Bill's idea?
Oh, yes.
Wonderful.
And it wasn't just, freedom here. It would be freedom and then the context. So you could open up the index, go to freedom, and read the index and get an overview of what Professor meant by freedom from the index. And we only used his words.
Mm-hmm.
It was like quotes in the book.
Uh-huh.
It was like little snippets of quotes from Professor in the context. And then we'd have the page in the volume and you could go back. Just reading the index would give you a whole new education in the whole thing. And that's what Eric worked with on Bill. He and Bill worked together to make the index. He would start it and Bill go, okay, that's kind of close. And then he would change it, and then it would be added into the changes. And then I would get the index one, and then I'd be sitting there dutifully typing in the changes and the index and all the rest of it, and making sure all the computers were good, and we were backing up all of our work. So if the computers crashed, we were fine.
Wow.
And we sat there, and from 97 to just before 2000, we turned the book into reality. And we went over it 3 times. And
this is the first... The whole thing?
The whole thing.
Okay.
Every single page in the book was done. Well, first we printed it out and read it over and made sure it was correct. And then made all those changes. But when the editing started, we went over it every chapter 3 times. Word for word, punctuation for punctuation.
Wow.
I sat there and I would do it. Now, Bill Luck, there was one time where towards the end of the book, the series that we had done, Bill said, "Oh, let's just pull open." And we had the boxes and boxes of all the printed, and he reached in and pulled one out. It was the one we had just finished. And he had made not 3 sets of changes, but he had made some final 4th changes. So I jumped out of and he just happened to pull out, and his eye fell right, I'll never forget this, to a word, and he says, "Ben." Yeah. Because he was when it came to Stickler, he was as bad as Professor on making it perfect. He said, "Ben, get your butt in here." Come in. I look, and here is a spelling error.
Uh-oh.
Out of 120 pages, 150 pages, here was a spelling error. Because after every run of the changes, I would run 2 or 3 spell checking. But what happened was he made some final changes, and I made a mistake.
Yeah.
But I didn't run the spelling check. I went back and ran the spell check, 2 or 3 times, and there was only 1 spelling mistake.
And he found it. Well, it's a good thing.
Oh, I know. But that's the stickler he was, and I wanted that level of precision.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. And then, yeah. So, and the other thing is, he had an office down in Point Loma, and we would walk out the sliding glass door, and there was a grass of about 25 feet, and there was the Pacific Ocean.
Wow.
And so in my office, as I worked on this, I would occasionally look out, and there was the Pacific Ocean, and then you could see La Jolla off in the distance. If you walked out and listened. And there were some times when big storms would come in during those winter, and the waves would be hitting, and they would spray, and the water would be spraying on the windows.
Oh my, you were close.
We were close. And at the end of the day, we would drink a couple of beers and sit out there after. We'd start at like 7 o'clock. I'd start at 7 o'clock, and about 7 or 8 o'clock at night, we'd open some beers, have a little dinner, and then call it quits. And he would keep editing, and the next morning I would get it and go over and over. So we were working 12 hours, 13, 14 hours a day, 6, sometimes 7 days a week.
Oh my.
But this was
You did take this seriously.
This book is for the ages.
Yes.
So.
All right. So I think you've touched on some of them, but I understand that Professor Galambos has some very specific parameters of how his work was to be published. Can you describe what those were?
Okay. Professor said, well, Principia, Newton's book, triggered the modern age, was printed in, what was it, 1685, 86, 87, right around that time. And those books are around today. And they're not yellowed. They're in pristine condition if they've been respected and cared for and stayed in the library. So Professor knew, and then our scrolls that go back to ancient Egypt including Archimedes' work. And so this is another book for the ages. And he said it needs to show the same level of quality. The first edition, the first appearance in print of a book is historic. And it should be shown that respect. Now, the problem in this day and age is that we've gone into mass production of paper and books and all the rest of it. But the publishers know 99% of the books, hell, if they fall into dust within 100 years, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
You know, there'll be electronic versions and all of that. So these books had to be constructed for the ages. And that started with the paper. And the second is and he said faux leather. The old books had leather. But his concept of morality and, volitional beings and all of that, he wanted faux leather.
Mm-hmm.
But it had to have the same durability as leather. They had to be what is called Smythe binding. So the paper, the folding, the art of the making of books, all of it had to be incorporated in this magnificent work of science as well as art. The art of the book had to match the science of the content. And Bill knew this. He'd heard it for many years. I had heard it. And we knew we were making a book for the ages. It had, our target date is the books had to last at least 400 years.
Wow.
400 years. And I'll talk a little bit, if time permits, about the paper and all of that. But that was Professor Speck's.
Okay. Did you want to say more about the paper now, or do you want to?
No, later, because it comes up in the subject. Because
okay.
when we were first editing it, we did the specs. We knew his fonts. We knew how it had to be printed. He spelled out what the font size was. It should be 8.5. I think he even spelled out it should be 8.5 by 11 size and that sort of thing. So the layout and the structure of it, those specifications, we started to live by. And we knew that once we got it done, then we had to deal with the second set of specs, which was the book itself, the physical manifestation of the layouts of the edited version that we were producing. So the first generation specs I've already talked about, and we met. We did our very best, and with the guidance of Bill and the three of us, I think we did it. I think it was really magnificent work.
Okay. And so tell me why did Professor Galambos title the book Sic Itur at Astra?
He had mentioned a couple of times that it kind of had been bounced around that this title might be applied. Sic Itur ad Astra means this way to the stars. And if anybody had listened to Professor's tapes for any, lectures for any length of time, he knew that his father would say to Professor Galambos when he was young and a boy, and he did something right, his father would say, Sic Itur ad Astra. That was his praise, to say, this is the way to the stars. You're doing something right. So later, and I'm not sure where this information was given, but I know I got it from Bill. And the next book after, one of the first books after the magnum opus that was to be published, and I think I now remember, I think Mrs. Galambos' book was a small primer on Joseph Galambos, Professor Andrew Galambos' father, that there should be a major biography written of his father, because he used his father as the model of integrity. And he saw his father injure himself financially because he wouldn't go against his own integrity. And the professor always said his model of what the ideal of integrity, which is the engine of civilization, looked like, was his father. And the name of the biography, the premier biography that he wanted to write, or eventually someone write, was going to be Sic Itur ad Astra. That was to be the name of his father's biography.
Oh.
You see?
How did it get to be the name of this one?
It wasn't us.
Oh.
It was the trustees. This trustee couldn't shoot straight if his life depended on it. I know Professor would be spinning in his grave saying shoot straight, but...
What should the name of this have been? What did you guys have
The Theory of Volitional Science.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes a lot more sense.
And then the volumes would have been V50 and V201, and then each chapter had each session had its own title. It was the Theory of Volitional Science. Nothing more, nothing less.
Okay. All right. Well, that's interesting. It really is. So did you finish, what was the first thing you finished?
We finished V50. It was a 550-page, 600-page volume.
Did you take that all the way to binding, or did you just have that in a PDF, or what was it?
We of course we had it in PDF. And then we had this nice printer with the color, the 3D color printer. Mm-hmm. So we printed it up and got it velabind. And
okay.
And one little side note, I don't know how many people know velabind. You're familiar with? I
am. Yeah.
Yeah, velabind. But just kind of a side note, my dad, the fellow who developed that, was a doctor in San Diego who personally knew my dad, and I knew him personally. And I went up and saw he had a facility up in San Jose that was making the velabind process back in the 70s when it first came out. And so here I was binding, and I knew of him, and so I got everything velabind. Uh-huh. So we velabind the first prototype, a 600-page book.
I didn't even know they made those spikes that long.
Yeah.
So that must have been a pretty long.
Yeah, it was,
thick book.
And I'm not sure if it was thick or if I would have gotten the thickest, those things, because halfway through you open it up, break it in half. Ah. But yeah, it was, we velabind it, and we got the kind of the red color that Professor loved the red color. So we were trying to find a fire engine red. It was that was going to be red, faux leather red, with the embossing of Volitional Science on the cover, gold embossing.
Cool. And so that one's done. And
yes.
Did you celebrate?
Oh, yes. I mean, we had some celebration. We were looking at, okay, we got V50, which was one box, or box and a half. And then we were looking, and here were like 6 or 7 more boxes. The beast itself, V201. And we were going, okay. Yeah, we got the first volume done. Okay. But we were going, yeah, we had a little celebration. And then the next day, the next week, we dove back into it, and we were, it wasn't the next week.
So what did you do with that first volume?
Okay. We printed a copy. And by this point, Bill was getting very, very concerned about the trustee. And Mrs. Galambos put another trustee onto it. And Bill actually got this guy. He was a real piece of work. He was an accountant down in San Diego. But Professor did not like this guy. Bill knew he didn't like this guy, but Mrs. Galambos liked him. And so he was put on after professor had become incapable of making a decision, and we got him kicked off. So there was only one trustee. And the trouble was that the estate was worth a couple of $1 million. And we were burning through this money. And we said, there's nothing more important. When we get done, there will still be enough to protect Professor's tapes, his intellectual property. And once the book gets out and we start building up an awareness of the theory, new money will come. But these guys were looking at this estate, this $2 million, and Professor and his wife had no children. There was no one else looking over their shoulders. They had millions of dollars, a couple of $1 million, along with a home and apartments, and I know that Professor had quite a bit of gold because when I helped clean up the apartment, I found some of the gold. Mm-hmm. And they had this piggy bank. Mm-hmm. And here we were doing Professor's bidding. It was going to take $500,000. And by this point, okay, what happened was when the book trust died, we realized we could not satisfy the need. Professor even went to court and said he really couldn't be held financially responsible for delivering those books because this trustee, if he had kept the money himself, which Professor said in the long run he should have because he wouldn't have touched it and he would have been safe. And if we had $2 million to make his book, oh my goodness, it would have been something amazing. But the money was gone, and Professor had already gotten a court ruling that he wasn't personally, financially responsible. But I think Professor, we had all agreed that we would try to satisfy and get copies to them. So what happened was we were working on the assumption that we didn't have to fulfill all 600 or 700 orders of Professor's book. So we looked at Newton. Mm-hmm. And Newton said, Newton's Principia, there was 306 copies made. And we said, that would be historic. We will, on the first edition, we will make 306 or whatever. I'm just trying to remember. It was in the 300s, but I think it was 306. We were going to make the exact same number of first editions to Newton, Galambos as to Newton. Then we would go back to the people who had ordered the book. We would have the ability to produce it and say, now it's just the cost of the paper and quality paper, and we'll make the second edition second edition. How many of you would be willing on a minimal cost to cover cost of production to get the second edition? The first edition is the first edition, and that could go for, we were thinking minimum, no one would touch that book for less than $5,000 a copy, for 15 volumes, maybe 10,000. That would be the premier. Mm-hmm. And as the theory grows and becomes greater and the significance grew, that value would grow for the estate. Mm-hmm. And then after the second edition goes to those people who helped, had the book trust, then we would do the third, that would go. And then, by the way, I had the idea. Professor Bill thought it was a pretty good idea. The first 3 chapters. Remember I told you when I was invited, you could listen to the first 3 sessions for $20?
Right.
I said that's what we should publish. We should publish a real small version. Just those 3 chapters with the index as a primer. Sell them, make them quality, but sell them for like $50. The introduction to the theory of volitional science and postulatory structure, something he would have come up with a name, and he thought it was a great idea. And that would have gotten a good cash flow started for putting out, and people could get that and say, oh, here's this book. And eventually you could make after you had a good quality hard copy, then you could go into paperback and get the knowledge distributed. So that was our goal. 300 and whatever books, versions that would stand at least 400 years. And if you treated it and with technology, you'd probably go for thousands. And it was going to cost $500,000 to $750,000. And we gave him, but Bill was starting to hear rumblings from this trustee and his sidekick that had been kicked out, saying, oh no, that would eat up a third or more of the estate. And we said, who cares? The most important thing is not the money. It is professor's theory making it, and the contract, and people keep batting back. Professor said, don't talk about this in public. You know, he had an exclusion, you know, and they all complain about that contract, you know, mum's the word. Mm-hmm. The reason, if you read it carefully, and Professor talked about this, it was only in force until the book got out. Because people can misapply things in a million different wrong ways.
Right.
And then if they pointed back to him and said, oh, I did this wrong and someone lost $5 million, they said, well, we were applying Professor's theory and you weren't anywhere close. He was protecting himself and the reputation of the theory from all the nudniks that thought they could apply it, which were basically brain dead. And he says, once the book is out, you can apply it as you will. Because now people can go back and they have a written form and you can go back to it and say, oh, no, you did. Oh, and especially with the index, you can look it all up and say, oh, well, you could go through Bill's index and Eric's index and go, oh, well, here's gratitude or compensation mechanism. Here's all the terms. So you go and think, oh, hell, you screwed up here and you screwed up there and you screwed up here and you screwed up there. And no wonder it failed. Mm-hmm. Professor restricted the knowledge flow until the book was out because people screw things up so bad.
Yeah, it's true.
So it worked out that in Professor's estate, it happened to get screwed up. These guys were looking at the money. And I think they were using it for their own piggy bank. I don't know. And I wonder how much of the estate is still left and how many of the tapes are still in good shape. But they weren't willing to do the high quality. They wanted to do a paperback. First edition, Professor Galambos, paperback.
Oh boy.
And Bill looked him straight in the eye and said, over my dead body. That ain't going to ever happen. But before that happened, he was already getting rumblings of the grousing. As Professor called it, chintzy factor. So he says, we're not going to give him any. We gave him a few, I think, of the first. I don't even know if we gave him the first PDF, electronic versions, the PDF. So when it came time, we gave him the book, printed.
The vellum-bound copy?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it went out. We gave it to them. And then we started our task. And we said, no more. And they said, well, we're not going to pay you. Okay. But by that time, Bill had the mailing list of all the people who had bought the book. And we wrote up letters and folded them up and a mailing list of 600 people, inviting them to a meeting. And a lot of them, 40 or 50 of them came. and we had a couple of copies of our book up on the shelf at the meeting hall. And lo and behold, there was one noble graduate. And he saw what we were doing and what we had. And then he came to the office and saw how we were doing it. And he proceeded to pay the necessary funding to do the book. And we kind of jumped ahead. He wanted to get the paper and the printing in place so that, it was all ready for us. And we said, well, we could do it later. But he kind of insisted. So right from the start, that's when I found out the nature of paper. And that's why I was coming back to it now. After he came in, we went down and saw him where he lived, and then I flew up to Louisville. And then I went over to St. Louis and then back to Louisville, and there were some stories there I won't go into. But we finally got a printing house in Louisville because Louisville is a printing hub, one of the printing hubs in the country. They do a lot of printing.
I know that.
And when I was there, I worked with these people. And the specifications that I came with were something they had never heard of before. That, if their brochures or their
Did
pamphlets.
that surprise you?
No. And we proceeded to go through all the paper, their contacts, and we got experts in, and they learned more about paper in those 2 weeks that I was there than they had ever done in a Smythe binding. And then we went into inks, and they were experts on inks until you said they have to have 200-hour UV. That means it has to sit in full sun for 200 hours and still be readable. And they go, well, we don't have any inks that do that. Of course you don't. But you have to find the inks that will be usable on an offset print but meet that requirement. And so we went through a whole slew of requirements, and then we finally identified all the inks, and we had everything set up, ready to go to print. So we went ahead, and the next year and a half we went back, and this fellow paid us essentially $12,000 a month to turn out he paid us on sessions. We sent him a printed copy of each one after the other, after the other, after the other. And for month after month after month, I just printed it. We just went through the whole of things. Produced, I think it was 14, 15 volumes. I can't even remember how many volumes it broke out into.
Each about 500 pages?
500
like
pages.
That? Wow.
400, between 400 and 600 pages. And then with the index. I think it was, because I forget. It was well over 10 or 12 volumes.
So, well, what happened? Because nobody ever saw one of those copies, did they?
All right. Well, unbeknownst to us, the Nudniks in Los Angeles, the trustee and his sidekick, got someone in, and they took ours and our book and scanned it in. And they then did OCR, and they worked it all out, and they did all their magic. And in those years from the end of 97, 98 to the middle of 99, as we worked, they announced, because we announced to the community that we were going to make the book, they found someone and said, oh, we can do. And we met this guy. He was up in Idaho or wherever he was from. And he says, oh, I can do this too. And so they announced to the world that V50 was coming. And they were going to do 201. And they could accomplish it in 3 years, 4 years. So, okay. So they went their way.
But by that point, you already have it done.
No,
Oh.
this is when we had the break and we announced.
Okay.
They in turn announced to the community, oh, they're going to come out with a V50
Okay.
in the next year. And in 5 years, they were going to have all of V201 done.
But the V50 was yours.
They didn't tell the world that it was ours. But they basically took it and scanned it in.
And then sold it. Or
bound it as a paperback, the one that sells for, how much did you say it sells?
I've seen them on Amazon for several $100s.
Yeah,
I don't,
3, 4.
They range widely in what their asking price is. So
yeah,
like
and
500, 800, 1300. It's just all over the place.
It's a paperback. And so they took it, they scanned it in, they reset it, or kind of reconfigured it. And it took them to take our original copy that took us 2 months to do, to perfect our methods. And I'm saying from the time we started to the time we ended, it took us 2 months or so to do. But there were months before that to get the entire thing set up and working and proper, all the typesetting and the color balance and everything else. So they took ours, they scanned it, and then reset it. And I don't even know if I even looked at the colors and see if they even got close to the proper colors. And they did all of this. And just as we finished the last volume, the last session of V201, all those thousands of pages, and it was all set and ready to go. And just a couple of weeks before, they finally came out with their version. It took them 1.5 years to do what we had done in 4 months, 3 months, starting from scratch. And so Bill heard about it because he had contact. We all had contacts into the greater community that Professor Galambos had. And we finally got a copy. Obviously, they were going to be giving a low price offer to people that had bought the book to purchase this book. And so they sold Bill. They didn't send us one, obviously, but we purchased one through a third party. And we got it. And Eric sat down and said, we opened it up, and immediately the pictures that, the slides and the pictures were in the exact same place. The paragraphing was the same. The punctuation was the same. The typesetting was all the same. Basically, they scanned it, OCR, redid it, and realigned it, and sent it out. Then Eric started going through, and in the first page he said, oh, there's a spelling error. There's another one. There's another one. And so he took a couple of weeks, went through the whole damn thing. There was like 650 typos in V50. There was none in ours. So what they did was they scanned it in, did a spell check, didn't bother to go back through and read it word for word, line for line. They got it, found a printer, sent it off, got it bound in a cloth paperback version, the glue back version, slapped the thing together for probably $50 a book, and sold it for maybe $20 on probably paper that in 100 years from now will be completely gone. Because they probably got what was called acid-free. There were 2 kinds of acid-free paper. This is what I learned.
What's the difference?
One is that it's a standard acid process to make the paper. Then they put a buffering in it to neutralize the paper. After 20, 30, or 40 years, the buffering wears out. The acid comes back, and it's the acid that turns it yellow and causes the paper to fall apart. Even the 25% cloth with cellulose, even all of those are generally made with acid process. It's a mass production, cheap way to make it. And then they throw in a buffering agent. But it allows books to last for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
But after 100 years, they're gone. We got paper. That's why it cost. The fellow bought $40,000 worth of paper for these 300 books. The paper was so bloody expensive because there wasn't a drop of acid involved in the process of making that paper. It wasn't acid buffered. It was acid free.
Oh.
And it was 25% cloth and 75% cellulose because we couldn't find anybody who made pure cloth paper anymore. And it couldn't be run through the offset printing presses. And it would have cost $10 million if we hand printed it all.
So you guys are at the point where your book is ready to publish.
Yes.
Your book, your volumes, your 15 volumes,
Are ready to publish.
5,000 pages are ready to go, and this comes out. This piece of crap comes out.
Yes.
And so then what does Bill do about that?
He goes and finds out that there are different kinds of copyrights. All of that effort to align and set up and punctuation and the typesetting and all of that, taking from what was in that box to what was in that book, that's a copyright. So there are two competing copyrights. Professor's content and the presentation of that content in the elegant form that we got it into.
Oh.
Bill got the lawyer. And if anybody wonders why the estate isn't selling it anymore, the criminals stole it from us.
Uh-huh.
They didn't go back and do all the work and reset it. Hell, they said they were going to do all of V201 and it was supposed to be out that was in 97 and they were going to have it out by 2005. I calculate right. I think it's 2019 right now.
Yeah, they're a little late.
They're a little late. And we did it in 2 years. So Bill went back and hit them with a copyright. And so now what ended up, why the book isn't out there, is where they were in a Mexican standoff. Personally, I don't know how. Now, what happened with Bill and I, because right as I finished this book, and Bill finished, I shouldn't say my participation in this book came to an end. At the same time, the story of U.S. Medical was playing itself out.
Back to the safety syringe.
Safety syringe, because the two are intimately entangled.
Right. Same timeline, kind of.
Same timeline. Two different stories.
It's going on at the same time.
What we were hoping I thought, my goodness, the early 2000s was going to be an absolutely amazing time for me. Because here was Professor's magnum opus soon to be coming out. I had the glorious, beautiful opportunity to have a participation in it. One of my greatest achievements. My greatest gratitude to Professor. And by the way, I just got room and board. All that money went to Bill to keep him going and that sort of thing. And I just had a little apartment over his garage. Food, room and board. I didn't care. Here was Professor's book. It was like, if you know what Newton meant to the world now, and you could have been in Halley's position. Halley paid for it. Newton didn't pay for his own book, and I don't know how many people know it, but the Royal Society was supposed to pay for Newton's book. Halley had arranged it. And when Newton finally got it done, the Royal Society had one of two choices. It had enough money to publish one of two books. They had Newton's Principia and a book on ichthyology, or fish.
Don't tell me.
Guess what the Royal Society decided to publish.
Don't tell me. Not fish.
That is probably one of the greatest embarrassments of the Royal Society. And so Halley oversaw the publication of it out of his own money.
Wow.
Hell, I didn't have to go quite as far as Halley did to put up money. I just had to put up time. Not make much money, but I guess time is equal to money. So I was saying, if it's good enough for Halley, hell, what else do I have better to do?
Right.
So here I was with his book coming out, and we have the roadmap of civilization. Then here was U.S. Medical that could give us the money to do it. And then it all hit the fan. I went up with Bill and I saw the automation machine that Matt got. And everything that I said and warned Matt about 3 years before came true. Here was a step machine, not a continuous flow machine, elegant step machine. It was a flow machine. It was a step machine with 15 stages in it. And at any one point, one of the stages wasn't working.
Oh.
And he paid 1.2 or 1.6 or 1.8 million. Whatever he paid for it was way too much. $10 was too much for that piece of crap. And then I went back and we were basically done and wrapping up the book. And about that time, Bill saw the piece of crap that the guys came out with, which was our version. And Bill started looking at it and said, oh, I could do better here and I could do better there. And he said, we're going to do V50 one more time. Well, the book was essentially done. I agreed with him he needed to get the V50, take our talents that we've developed over all these V201 to do a V50, and so go over it one more time. But it was essentially ready.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other piece of this wonderful puzzle, that is the making of enough money to take this theory and put it into operation, was falling apart before my very eyes. I went to Bill. So I took some time and I got a drawing program, and I started drawing the first stage of a small continuous flow machine that would put just 2 of the parts together. And I figured out how I could do all 6 of them, 6 stages, and then a 7th final assembly, and we could build this automation machine. So I designed it out, looked at the flow, rotated it, used motion, stepping motion and animation to get pretty close to what I looked like it would do what I needed. Then I went to Bill and I said, Bill, right now, Matt got himself into trouble, and Bill's client, biggest investor into U.S. Medical, saved Matt's butt, but had what was called a perfected lien agreement. So he had the keys to the kingdom. I said to Bill, if we don't build an automation machine and we don't get control of this is going to implode. And so I stood in front of him in his desk and down in Point Loma. And I spoke with him like I had never spoken with him before. I never pushed him and gave him a pushback. But I pushed him as hard as I pushed Matt when he made this stupid decision that now has cost him the rest of the 35 years or whatever part of his remaining life in jail. I said to him, we have to take this over. You have to go up to your clients and you have to take control of this. First, give me enough money to make the first of these machines. And I know how to make it. I was going to use early 3D printing. This is in 1999. No one ever heard of 3D printing. Most engineers hadn't heard of it, much less third graders hearing about 3D printing. This was back when it was brand new and incredible. I said, we can use this and then another process, and we can build some prototypes. So back where we were. So what happened was I told Bill, I know how we can do this. Unfortunately, I already talked and was starting to express some concerns about Bill to the Siegel brothers months and months and months ago, before this, in probably a year and a half ago, saying we may have to take this away from Matt. But I didn't have any specific plans. But
did you talk about the Siegel brothers? Who is that?
oh, I'm sorry. Someone that was the big customer.
Oh, okay.
For Bill. I think they're probably both gone. They were in their 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And they were big investors in U.S. Medical. And they were the ones that saved it. So I said to Bill, we have no choice. We have to take this away from Matt. We have to build an automation machine, and we have to restart this thing. Or all of your clients, you, the people you put in, and everyone else is going to lose. Matt screwed this up. I told him he was going to screw it up. I was hoping that he wouldn't screw it up, but he screwed it up. And we have to rebuild around an automation machine. And the next day, fairly soon after I left to go on a family trip. And when I got back, I went into Bill's house and I sat down and I waited. And I waited. And for an hour and a half, I knew he was upstairs. I waited for him to come down. And I wasn't going to leave until he came down. Finally, he came down and said, I don't want to ever see you again. I said, okay, good enough. I'll go get my stuff. He says, no. I'll get Eric to get it all together. I said, fine. So I gave him the keys. And I walked out. That was the last time I ever saw Bill. And it was, even though all the stresses, inconsistencies that I had with Bill, it had been a long relationship. And here I was.
Started in
82.
82. Wow, that's a long time.
And we had gone through building up a safety syringe. We had done something absolutely amazing that people wanted, the book. And we got Professor's book. Then what happened was that after I left, the Mexican standoff between Bill and the estate developed. I never got PDFs of the version of that book. I hope Eric, if he ever hears about this or sees this, I hope he has it. Maybe Bill's family have it. The book is ready, or it was ready to go to publishing. We had the paper.
That's a sad story. That must be heartbreaking for you. I mean, everybody else is gone, but
yeah,
to know that, and to know what people are saying about Professor having never done it and not having the intellectual capacity to do it and all that.
Oh yes, and that it wouldn't sound good if he thought it wouldn't work out in printed form and that sort of thing. I've heard that one. And the crazy thing is that before Professor and what we did, the guys at Caltech did the same sort of thing for Feinstein. I mean, not Feinstein, Feynman.
I don't know who that is.
He's one of the great nuclear physicists.
Oh, okay.
The Feynman diagrams and all that, and he simplified the ways of looking at nuclear interactions. He gave a year-long lecture in basic physics at Caltech, and they recorded it all, and the grad students translated it, and it's called the Red Books. I have them. It's a magnificent presentation of physics. And we did the same thing for Professor. And like I said before, you read this, it's like hearing Professor. It is better. In some ways, it's better than the audios because you can stop and you can go back and you can go up a page and you go forward a page.
Underline, you can highlight, you can ruminate. Well, I know you don't want to write on the book, but some people do stuff.
Yeah,
like that,
well, if you have a paperback, not for, please, if you get a first edition, if this ever comes out and it's in a first edition, don't highlight the first edition. You'd have to be crazy because it'll be in the equivalent of now $10,000 or $20,000 right now for each copy. But yeah, the paperbacks when it's broken down into all of its different forms. Yeah, it was magnificent. You read it, and people say, well, it could have all been done in a lot shorter time period. But you start looking at the book and you're reading it, and Professor never goes over. He never repeats himself. Well, I mean, he tells similar stories, but every time he tells a story in V50 or V201, it has a different meaning. Mm-hmm. It has a different context, different significance because it's in a different context. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't too long. In some ways, it's too damn short. But it's there. It was there. And I hope somewhere out there in this world, those PDFs are still there with all the color balance built into them.
What are the chances of it ever getting
I don't know.
into the hands of the people that wanted it, purchased it, are on that list?
For them, but they were looking at it for the next generation. The important thing is how can we inject this knowledge into the next generation and give them a chance?
Well, you certainly can't if it's stuck in somebody's drawer somewhere.
Yeah, or in some PDFs, but it's done. Anybody who's out there that paid for the book and we're listening to the estate, I'll let you know. It is all done. It is all complete and it is ready for the ages. But those nudniks that were running his estate, I bet they used almost all that money for their own personal. I bet they took salaries and they used it on themselves. And I wouldn't be surprised that the estate is all but gone.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It was quite
welcome.
a magnificent job and something to be very proud of.
Thank you.
I'm glad this story is finally told, and I think there might be a few that would like to hear it.
I hope so.
Okay. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.